ladies and gentlemen, this is Mrs. D, and today we're talking about energy transformations and cellular respiration. If you're here to learn about photosynthesis, please watch the next video that will have more information about that. Okay, so let's talk first what we need for energy. Why am I bothering telling you about energy? Well, the reason I'm telling you about energy today is because it is so important for your day-to-day activities. Whether you're sleeping, jumping, running, sitting on the couch watching your favorite TV show, your body is constantly using energy. Energy allows us to live and function. This is one of the things for the characteristics of life. And how does it do that? Energy allows our cells to do work. An example is a chemical reaction. Now remember, chemical reactions are supported by the proteins called enzymes, but the enzymes need energy, and that energy is ATP, and they use it to maintain a healthy and living lifestyle. So when you eat a cheeseburger, there is lots of potentially stored energy. However, your body can't use it without it being broken down. So in the bonds of food, there's ATP, and we use the bonds to make our ATP. So food energy must be converted into usable form of energy, and we call that energy ATP. So ATP is like the energy currency of cells. It's the money. It is what gets things done. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and if you look over here, the triphosphate means that there's three phosphates, 1, 2, 3, and those phosphates have bonds, and this last bond is a high energy bond, okay, right there, that third bond. There's a base, a sugar, ribose, and both the adenine and the ribose sugar we'll see again when we talk about DNA and RNA. The 3-phosphate or triphosphate, that is the place where the energy is actually stored, and this last bond is our high energy bond that gets broken and remade in order to release energy. So ATP releases energy when the bond between the second and third phosphate group is broken. When that bond is broken, ADP and a free phosphate group is formed. So we have the ADP, which would look like this, without this last phosphate, and this last phosphate would represent the free phosphate group. So again, we see ATP being broken down into ADP, and that's an example of an exergonic reaction. It's a energy releasing reaction. Energy exits the reaction, exergonic. And so when energy is released, when bonds break, again, that's that exergonic energy releasing. So going from ATP to ADP plus a phosphate group is an example of an exergonic reaction. The opposite is an endergonic reaction, and this is the reaction that yields energy, that stores energy. So the ADP we were talking about, okay, without that third phosphate, gains a phosphate. When it gains its phosphate, the energy is stored in that bond between the second and third phosphate. So ADP turns into ATP, and this is endergonic, meaning energy enters the reaction and is stored. So when energy stored when bond made is an example of an endergonic reaction or an energy storing reaction. This conversion from the energy stored in food into ATP, and here we see it, food we eat, and here's an ATP, is called cellular respiration. So taking our food, breaking it down to get usable cellular energy is called cellular respiration. And again, this is not breathing. Respiration is what you do when you breathe, but we're not talking about breathing. We're talking about the breaking down of food to ATP. So why are we talking about cellular respiration, and why is it important? Both plants and animal cells get energy through this process called cellular respiration. Fungi, other things get it as well, but we're really talking about plants and animals here. The main idea of cellular respiration is that the energy stored in the chemical bonds of glucose, and glucose is like carbohydrates, remember that's a monomer of a carbohydrate, is released and then converted into ATP. So when we break down the glucose, we release its energy and the body converts that energy into ATP. There are many steps to this process, but a general overview is following. Glucose, which again is a monomer of a carbohydrate, is a sugar, is broken down into ATP, and ATP is our cellular energy. We are now going to look at the equation for cellular respiration. Yes, you must memorize this. So we're going to first talk about aerobic cellular respiration. And when I use the word aerobic, I mean it has oxygen. So if you don't know that the word aerobic means oxygen, you might want to write that down. So aerobic cellular respiration uses oxygen. It happens in the mitochondria of the cell. And you might have heard of the powerhouse of the cell. And we're talking about the powerhouse, we're talking about the mitochondria. That's because it's sort of like a energy plant. It produces the energy. When we're doing aerobic respiration, it is very efficient. There's a lot of ATP that is made when we have oxygen present. So we're going to see the difference between aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic produces significantly more ATP per glucose molecule when compared to anaerobic. Alright, so let's look at the equation you need to memorize. First, C6H12O6. That's a really complicating sounding molecule, but really all it means is glucose. There's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. That, along with oxygen, are our body's reactants. What our reaction is going to start with. If you think about it, you eat, which is where we get our sugar, or C6H12O6, and you breathe in oxygen, right? So when you are trying to memorize this, think about what you consume, okay? What we get in return is water, carbon dioxide, and 38 ATP. And those are our products, or what we end with. Again, water, CO2, and 38 ATP are the final products for cellular respiration. If you think about going up to a mirror and breathing on it, you see sort of a fuzziness, or it gets cloudy. That's because the water of your breath is actually condensing, and you can see it, okay? CO2, you breathe out CO2. You know that if you were to be in a confined room, with nothing else but you in there, eventually you would pass out because there would be too much CO2. You'd expel too much CO2, and there wouldn't be enough oxygen for you. So the reactants are C6H12O6 and O2. That's what your body needs to take in order to get its 38 ATP. But to get the 38 ATP, we also need to produce H2O and CO2. Okay. Down below, I put the layman's terms. C6H12O6 is glucose, O2 is oxygen, H2O is water, CO2 is carbon dioxide, and 38 ATP is energy. So, separate pathways of cellular respiration occur in different places within the cell. Some use oxygen and some do not. They also produce different amounts of ATP. So we talked that aerobic is with oxygen. Now, anaerobic is the opposite. It is without oxygen. You do not need it or have oxygen present. Because there's no oxygen, it is significantly less efficient than aerobic respiration. There are 2 good examples here. Alcohol fermentation. And in alcohol fermentation, we get C6H12O6. And that's the sugar or glucose. And it's broken down into ethyl alcohol and CO2 and only 2 ATP. Now, if you think back to when we talked about aerobic cellular respiration, we produce 38 ATP. 2 compared to 38 is a big difference. So here we really do see how much better cells are at doing aerobic respiration. And again, no oxygen. Lactic acid fermentation is on the other side. And this is what happens when your muscles become overworked. So if you think you're working out and the next day you're sore, that's because when your body broke down in sugar, there was no oxygen present. And so instead of doing the typical pathway, it had to resort to making lactic acid. And that accounts for the soreness. Again, we see the 2 ATP here, and that is a lot less than the 38 made with aerobic respiration. Here is a very complicated picture of cellular respiration. It looks complicated. It is really much more simple when you explain it. So remember, all cellular respiration starts off with glucose. Glucose gets broken down in a process called glycolysis. It makes 2 pyruvate molecules. You do not need to know pyruvate, but it's just an informational tool. When we break down glucose during glycolysis, there are 2 ATP made, and it is anaerobic, meaning we do not need oxygen for this first step. Now, depending if your cell has oxygen, it's going to either do aerobic or anaerobic. If it has oxygen, it's going to do aerobic respiration. There's all these fancy things called the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. All it means is that at the end we produce CO2, H2O, and 36 ATP. Now the 36 ATP plus the 2 from glycolysis usually yields around 38 ATP. Now if your cell does not have oxygen, it is an anaerobic respiration. There are 2 routes, lactic acid fermentation or alcohol fermentation. Alcohol, this is how we get our alcohol for breads or beer. Lactic acid, this is what happens if you run a race and your cells lack enough oxygen. They have to go to lactic acid fermentation. If you look at the bottom down here, it tells us that only 2 ATP are made from glycolysis and 0 from the fermentation part, so we only end up with 2 ATP. If you have any questions, make sure you tell me and ask away. I want to answer all your questions. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.